Sometimes I have too many ideas in my head, can't decide what to work on next, and get stuck and lose motivation. The only way I found to get out of that rut is to just build something, usually the first thing that comes to mind. So when this block of XPS fell off my scrap pile, I thought, I'll just build a tiny house. I used a knife to give the block the rough shape of a house. While I do have a hot wire cutter, I don't keep it set up, and that kind of thing becomes kind of a roadblock when you're low on motivation, for me at least. I didn't feel like setting it up and putting it away again, so I'd probably keep putting it off. I wanted to build something now, so knife it was. Once I had the shape of a house, I decided to try something new and sculpt the textures out of milliput. So I mixed some up and spread it over one of the sides. The process is fairly easy as long as you keep the tools lubricated so the putty won't grab them. Make horizontal lines, then go back and make small vertical lines. The tool I'm using here is a bit chunky, so it makes V-shaped grooves in the putty. You can make very fine lines with a blade if you want to, but I prefer these wider grooves as I think they look more natural. I tried a couple of different ways of adding more texture to the walls, but the one I settled on is fairly simple. Just tap the flat side of your tool a few times on each individual brick, depending on how worn you want it to look. While I was doing this, I was also nudging the corners of the bricks to get rid of the pillow shape that you get when you form them. For the wood textures on the door and the back wall, I first made some heavy grooves in the putty, then made a lot of very light ones in between them. I tried to keep the heavy grooves fairly straight, but the light ones are random to simulate grain. To add more detail to the door, I used 2 thin rolls of putty and flattened them on the door to give it some bending. I did this before I built up the wall around it, as it's just so much easier. The door handle is fairly quick too. Just make a small ball, flatten it on the door, and use a point to make a hole in the middle. The hardest part is cutting a piece of putty small enough at this scale. I also did an extra tiny bit of putty to make the ring that connects the pull to the door, but to be honest that's so tiny I don't think anyone would notice if it wasn't there. I did the walls one at a time to give the putty time to cure so I wouldn't damage the faces I'd done already. To make sure the corners were seamless, I overlapped the new wall on the older one, and used the grooves on the existing wall to start the ones on the new one. You could of course just add more putty on top of the corner and shape it into larger bricks, depending on the look you're going for. Once I had the walls done, I had a spectacular brain fart and wanted to make a mold so I could cast this. Now, I've made molds before, but something went wrong this time and the mold was a total disaster. I'm not sure if it was the heat or something in the brand of starch that I used, but it just didn't work out. But hey, that's crafting for you. As a wise man once said,
sometimes may be good, sometimes may be shit.
At least I managed to get the model out in one piece. I cleaned the mold release off as best I could and got started on the roof. Since I was going with thatch and wanted a very dense texture, I cut some Play-Doh into the milliput mix. This makes it softer and easier to sculpt. Normally it also makes it take longer to cure, but at 39 degrees centigrade, the mix was rock solid in less than 2 hours. To make the thatch texture, I just spread layers of putty and cut lines into it, working from the bottom up. This is easier the tackier your putty is, so in hindsight I should probably have mixed smaller batches at the time. The edges are kind of tricky to texture this way, so what I did was just ignore them. Once the main roof was done, I added a strip of putty to each edge and textured them separately. Much easier. To finish off the building, I added a little piece on top and textured it like the rest of the roof to make a little cover for a flue. I blue-tacked the model onto a bottle to make it easier to handle, then sprayed it grey and tried to give it a white zenithal highlight. The spray can have other ideas and it spattered the whole thing. Because of course it did. It's okay, it's just paint, I could paint over it. In reality the paint up was very straightforward and went by really quickly. It was just dry brushing and washes. One thing that helped was avoiding using white and black paint. The highlights were done in yellow and ivory, while the shading was done with Seraphim Sepia, Burnt Umber and Payne's Grey. The end result is a lot less stark than if I had used black and white. The only place I used black was on the banding and the door pull, as a foundation for the graphite. This build was fairly straightforward except where I tried to be clever, and I think I'll be doing more buildings in this way. I will also try to cast them, but I'll get some proper caustic silicone and let the weather cool down first, so if you want to see more crafting in the meantime, check out this playlist. Bye!